Welcome to homework number 2. I've gone ahead and downloaded this file here. You'll notice a few things in this recording and in all the recordings I make for you. You'll notice that I've turned on some special features so that you can see really what my mouse is doing. Notice that as I click, you'll see some flashes and circles to draw your attention to the mouse area. I'll also try to describe what keys I'm pressing and other things like that. If you notice anything where it doesn't make sense, like for instance, if I've nudged something, which is where you kind of inch something along, and it just kind of magically happens, please let me know. I'm going to do my best, like I said, to call out the keys that I'm pressing, but I may occasionally make a mistake and not tell you. If that happens, like I said, I apologize, and we'll try and not have that happen. So, onward, I've gone ahead and downloaded this file, so I'm going to jump right into Vectorworks. I'm in my default file, right? We've already got our title block on that we did in class, and I'm going to resave this file. I'm hoping you already did those in class. Remember, we have those 3. This is a 1/4-inch scale document, so this is going to be Andrew Carson, and it's going to be homework 2. And then we also want to put the file size. See, you can double check that by going File, Page Setup, right? Or if you happen to know it, it's alright. I happen to know this is 11 by 17, so I'm going to just put 11x17. So I said Andrew Carson, homework 2, 11 by 17. And I can save this anywhere I want. Documents is just fine. Right? Something else I quickly suggest is if you go into Vectorworks, click Preferences, and you're going to see Autosave. This says Autosave every 15 minutes. I'm going to suggest you say every 2 or 5 minutes. I'll say 2. You don't want to have Autosave Original File. You want to say Autosave Backup File. And then you also want to have it to say Backup Folder in the original location. And then see where it says keep the 1 most recent? I'd say keep the 10 most recent. Now, with that being said, if you're working on very large files, like those that come from Bill Pearson, you're going to have to change these settings or you're going to overwhelm your computer. You may need to change it to 2, 3, or 4 of the most recent backups just because of file size. We'll deal more with this menu in a later time. Notice that it says 2 minutes have elapsed since the document was backed up. Do you want to create a backup copy now? The answer is yes. Right? It should then auto-save, and it should automatically deal with everything you need. We're going to deal with the title block and everything shortly. Those of you that chose to use the title block manager and the title block and border tool that I demonstrated in class, I'm going to show you some of those automated features at the end of this video. Okay, so let's get started. So I told you that I had already downloaded that file. So I'm going to go to Import, just like I showed you in class. Import PDF. Now there's something just a little bit different about all of this. See how I have Cad homework 2 right here? So I'm going to go ahead and click Open. Now see how it says Pages 1 from 1? You're going to need to click this All Pages button. Right, that imports all 5 pages of the homework. And we're going to wait a moment while it imports. Okay, and one of these pages is blank, so we just go ahead and delete that. Right, and I'm just going to drag these pages off to the side. Right, and I'm going to start with page 1. So, in order to be able to do all of these, I'm going to kind of drag this around so that they're all going to fit on one page. So some of these are quite simple, but some of them aren't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the lines. So thick lines, I would use 0.70 or larger for thick lines. Right? And I'm just going through and drawing my thick lines. Now, notice that I had made a mistake, and I did not, oops, sorry about that. See, that was a quick mistake, and I just clicked undo. One thing that I'm going to suggest as you get these in is to lock the page down. That's just a right click or two-finger click, and lock the page. That means it's not going to move, right? So what happened there was the page moved after I had already drawn my lines while I was trying to make my selection. So I'm going to just click up here on the just general arrow tool, the selection tool, and then I'm going to click on rectangle mode. It had already been in lasso mode. I'm going to draw a box around this. See how these have turned orange? That's going to be your indication that they're selected. And then again, I'm going to change these to 0.7. Right? Those are looking good. And then we notice that this next one is just a single thick line. So we're going to use the same thing. Notice it's already set to 0.7, so we don't have to do anything. Same thing here. Now we're getting to something slightly more complicated. So the line width has changed. I'll also show you how to do this using class styles. Classes are essentially, think of them as different pieces of tracing paper that you can place on top of each other to create your final file. Now, with that being said, this isn't something we need for this exercise, so I'm not going to demonstrate it now, but it is something that you will be using in class at a later point. And you're going to be really happy to have learned class styles because it can do a lot of these things automatically for you. Okay, so your next lines are thin, so I'm going to choose 0.5. Now, this one's interesting because it's a thin dashed line. So I've drawn a thin line, so now I have to change my line style. Right, so how might I go about that? Well, one of the things that I'm going to do is make sure my thickness is set right, and then see where it says, see the pen, it says solid? I'm going to say line type, and it's going to pull up an options menu, right? So one of the things we have here is all sorts of options. If we're not terribly happy with those options, we can go other places. So we have an ISO dash line, and that's perfectly fine. In the Vectorworks menus, there are many, many, many other options, but this one will work for now. Right? And we can see the dashes are not exactly the same, but they'll work just fine. Okay, so we have general lines down. Now, to change the different dashes, you're going to want to make your different choices. So, again, this shows what's in your file. But if we want to go to Vectorworks Libraries, just by clicking that triangle, and then you go to Defaults, Attributes, Line Types, you can bring up all the different line types. And that'll allow you to continue to do all of these sections. So I'll do that one more time. So again, if we start with this, this shows the only dash line in our file. To access the other dash lines, it's clicking the little triangle right there next to Vectorworks Libraries with the little Vectorworks logo right there. Clicking the little triangle next to Defaults, then Attributes and Line Types, and then clicking on this, and this accesses all of the different lines, right? To finish all of the rest of these, you'll actually see very clearly, it'll tell you what type of line, and you can visually see the dashes. So for instance, some of these are a narrow dash, some of them are a wide dash, some of them are a dot dash. Just scroll through until you find the one you need. I hope that's helpful. When you're trying to make these symbols, like the plaster line or the center line or any of these others, so my suggestion to do those is actually to make symbols. I'll show you to do that real quick. So this is actually really simple, shockingly simple. Right, so we type a single letter, and I'm not a fan of that font, so you can make that any font you want. A traditional would be a very heavy cursive. I'm a big fan of Avenir, so I'm going to use Avenir for this. I'm going to use Avenir Light. Right, so I've got the P, and in fact, this looks even lighter here, so I may even use Avenir Very Light, but I think this will work fine. So then I'm going to have this selected. I just used the cursor tool, which auto-selected. Sorry, that popped up. And then I'm going to hit Command-C, which is a copy command. I'm going to go Command-V, which is a paste command. So now these should be directly on top of each other, and indeed they are. Now, one important thing to note here is I'm going to hit the Shift key and select both of them. And then see how we have background here? See how it says solid and it shows white? I need it to say none. So the first one can be P, the bottom one needs to be L, so we can make our PL, right? And I just need to make this look like that. So I need to unselect the top. I'm going to use the nudge, so it's a shift and an arrow. You can also reassign this to be other things. Okay, that's about right, and then I'm going to nudge down. Nudge across. And we have our intersecting plaster line. I actually might, as a personal reference, move the P here over slightly just to improve legibility. And we have our PL symbol. So now, to make this a symbol, we select both of these items. We're going to group them. To group, you hit Command G. Notice how the box now contains the whole symbol. Now, if you were only using this symbol once, you may only need to group and not actually make a symbol. In this case, you could easily just group these. However, you want to be able to make this a symbol so you can use it many times in the future. So you're going to say, create symbol. Well, if you're not sure, you've forgotten where these things go, just type symbol. Right? And see, create symbol come up and it'll show you right where it is. Now, items like create symbol is a modify because you're modifying an object. Right? So it's modify create symbol down here. And you're going to name this plaster line. And on center, insert in walls, you don't really need that. So you can turn that off. You want it to be world-based, plan projection center. Insertion point, I would actually use next mouse click rather than plan projection center. Leave instance in place is exactly what you want. This is fine. And then assign to class, it would be the active class. You can also assign it to like a symbols class, but that's again something for later. And you want it to be top view. And then say OK. And then that's now saved as a symbol. Again, it's been 2 more minutes. Eventually, you may want to click don't back up for document for remainder of session, but I would use that with extreme caution. Every time this comes up, I would always click yes. Okay, so we have our plaster line symbol. Again, I'm going to go back to the arrow key. We're going to hold that lovely spacebar and drag our symbol over. Now, this is not going to line up exactly, and that's just fine. We get the idea. Oh, maybe it will line up exactly. Huh, there you go. Okay, so now we need to deal with that line. So we need to, again, go through and draw a line. So here's actually an interesting issue that just came up. So it's trying to make a line based on this document, and it's not drawing where I want. That's a problem, isn't it? So how might I fix this? Well, one thing I can do is turn off snapping, right? So this piece of snapping right here was what was causing our problem, snapped object. So I turn that off, and now it's doing exactly what I need. And zoom back out using that center spacebar tool and draw my line. And then again, I need to go into line thickness is thin, and then I want to go through and do line type, and then change this line type. Remember, I'm using Vectorworks libraries, defaults, attributes, and line types. And then I need a rather well-spaced dashed line. Let's try ISO 3, see if that works for us. So in this case, it's a little hard to see that line, so I'm going to drag it up just slightly. That looks like it's just fine. So I'm going to drag it right back, and that'll work. I'm going to show you one other trick real quick. So I'm going to just do a quick Command C, that's a copy command, and I'm going to do a Command V. The technique I've showed you here for the lines applies to all other areas. Now we have a CL center line that's rotated, so I can easily just make that symbol right side up using our rotate tool, which I just clicked on, which is in your basic tool palette. I'm going to get this compass, or I'm sorry, get this protractor tool, which is the rotate tool. And then I'm going to have it set up like this, hold shift, and rotate the symbol. And then that would work just as well for the center line. Okay, I'll let you do your own lines. Leader lines or whiplash lines I kind of talked about in class. I personally prefer to draw them by hand, right? So you can do something like that with an arrow. And then arrowhead. So the arrowheads are actually kind of interesting. So if I was to insert this arrowhead here, that would actually be on the wrong end of the line. So I actually want to insert an arrowhead on the other end of the line. Notice how the arrowheads are quite large. You can change that. You can also use different arrowheads. See how they're just incredibly oppressively large. So my suggestion is if they're too big, you can actually go in and say, root size curved arrow. That's my preference because it's a little pointier. And then you can say size. Length is 1.25. How about 0.5? Say okay. Notice how that arrow is more appropriately sized. You can do the same thing. This is just using this freehand tool. And I have some specific settings. I have smoothing set to medium. And notice that looks very similar to that whiplash line. These would be drawn with 2 lines, or you can actually use the note insertion tool. I would just for now use 2 lines and then put that arrowhead on. Extension and dimension lines. Extension and dimension lines are kind of interesting. We can do this automatically just using the dimension tool. And that would be my suggestion for this section. So all I would do is do constrained dimension lines. Look how they magically look very similar. But again, remember, we're using a different standard. And see how this looks exactly like that. Again, done automatically, nothing you need to do there. So again, I just chose to draw a dimension line. I selected it here, but that same constrained dimension tool is also available right there. So for sectionized solid, my suggestion on how to do this, I would just draw a box here. We're going to make some choices. We're going to say fill we're going to deal with as a hatch. And notice that's squares. That's not the hatch we want. So this is the same thing. Vectorworks libraries, defaults, attributes, hatches. And if we click on hatches, we click on the hatches, we can see them. Right, so a brick hatch is actually a pretty decent one here. That looks just like our document. And then the line here, we're going to say none. Because notice how the thing didn't have lines. And that's perfect. So sectioned solid wood, we can do exactly the same thing. But in this case, we're going to draw several boxes. We're going to draw one box to be the actual spacing, right? And then we would draw two additional boxes. I'm going to delete this just for clarity. Then we're going to draw two additional boxes for the hatching. See, one right here, one right here. And then we would draw a third box that fills between the two. And that would be solid black. And then we would use the hatching. Oops, sorry, it didn't change my tool. It's my fault. And we would just select these two, just click the first one, then hit shift, click the second one. And we're going to do the same thing that we would have done before. We're going to go to pattern, we're going to go to solid, that's the line type. We can go here. Instead of solid, we're going to click hatch. Again, it's the wrong hatch. So we're going to go back and we're going to choose a brick hatch. There are many, many different hatches. Many of these are not ones that are used in the theater, but they could be actually useful for projects later on. So let's pick one that's a nice generic hatch. That's interesting. I'm not seeing the one we used momentarily. We could use a parking aisle hatch, but it's going to be awfully wide. See how you only get one line there? So that's not going to work for us. Oh, here's our brick hatch. I just missed it. And see how that looks very similar to the document. Section outline. This is again using just standard line tool to make all of these in an extra thick. So I'll just quickly demonstrate extra thick. Extra thick. I'm just drawing a single line here for this case. Again, it would be solid. And then line thickness, instead of being 0.7, might be 1.4 or 2.0. In this case, it's likely 2.0. And I'm going to drag that line away so you can see how thick it indeed is. Right, so this would be a 2.0 or maybe even larger than 2.0. One of the things with Vectorworks is as you get closer, the lines appear to be thinner. That allows you to make more precise measurements because the center of the line, this orange part, that's actually where the line physically is according to the program. The black is the extension or the size, this 2.0 line thickness. I hope that explains that. Break lines. I'll go ahead and go through with break lines. Break lines are actually an automatic feature. And if you go to the tool sets down here, remember how we were in the dimensions and notes tool set? You go down here, there's actually an automatic break line tool. You don't have to draw these. You just simply click your point, hold shift. Shift is, of course, if you want a straight line. Go to your other point, and you can say break style. In this case, you want straight. And then see how sometimes it'll say line too short to contain break? So that means that this is actually way, way short. So what we can do is draw the line out here to here and see how we have an issue, right? So the shape is right, but the line is too small. So we're going to delete that again. We're going to go in and use the break line tool again. We can also make our own little break lines, and I can show you how to do that in class. So see how it says line too short to contain break. So I can actually change that by saying break width is, instead of 3/8 of an inch, it's 1/4 of an inch. Break height is 1/4 of an inch. And break radius is 1/8 of an inch. Right? And see, it's still not working. So if we drew larger lines, we would be able to do this. But according to this program, and according to the scale, this line is only a foot wide. So we can work on that separately. I don't want to take the time to do that, but I'm going to quickly show you if that happens to you, because it's not an entirely uncommon thing to happen, how you can draw your own little breaks. So in this case, it's just one line here, another line down here, up, just hit the space bar to move around, and space. I'm going to then draw a little rectangle around here. I'm going to group that. You can make it a symbol, but I don't know if that's actually necessary. And so that draws your grouping there. I can then go forward and draw my lines here. Here. Again, we're hitting that 2-minute period. Here. Here. And here. Now, with that being said, if we go back to our break line tool, this is indeed large enough for break line, so it'll do that for you. And it doesn't have to be exactly this. There is a break line here, and it's known that this is a broken line. Right, so that's going to work just fine there. And now you're done with that piece. The cutting plane line. So in this case, you would actually draw 2 L's and then a separate line here. Separate line right in here. That would signify the actual cutting plane. Same thing here, except for you're omitting that center section. Phantom line is just a different type of line type, and again, you would just drop down, make sure your line is thin, and then drop down and pick the line style that matches that phantom line. Datum line, same thing that we've done before, thin line, and you would make a DL. Datum lines are very much going out of use. They had to do with the original iterations of Cad. Cad needed datum lines much more than it does now. A lot of that data is now available to be held invisibly within the program, where it used to have to be visible on the page. So that's page 1. So now you're going to say, well, now my page is stuck down. I can't select it. So now if you click on the object and you right click, you can say unlock. See how the page then becomes selectable? You can drag it away, and we have all the work that we've done here. Isn't that great? It looks awesome. Right? You have everything from your whiplash line, to your line types, to your hatches, to all of these other items. So now we can drag in another page, right? So this one might be an option. I think that one's actually relatively straightforward now that we've done some of these other objects. So what might not be as straightforward? Well, how about one of the ones that's going to be the best? So, windows and doorways. Windows and doorways are things that we use all the time. There are window and doorway tools within Vectorworks. So, I'm going to take a half a moment to go ahead and show you some of those. And I'm going to show you the upsides and the downsides. So, if I go to Building Shell, and I draw a quick wall here, right, I just drew a little L-shaped wall. And then I go down and I click on window, or sorry, archway. I'll do archway. That's through the door tool. It's going to bring up a whole bunch of options. And I click settings. And it's going to ask me what I want. So this is a super simple arched entry. So instead of saying a lot of these things, top shape, I'm going to say round because that's arch. And there's no swing on this because it's an archway. So what we'd say is cased opening. So that should look something like that. And we're going to say okay. And then okay. And it's still showing a swing. So let me restart and try that one more time because I must have made a mistake. So sometimes you have to use those contextual clues to know whether or not there's an issue. In this case, there was. So my cased opening didn't hang. That's alright. And so it looks like none of my settings here actually stayed set. So I'm going to say cased opening, round top, no transom. Let me say okay. And notice it still shows cased opening, which is good. Now in this case, we're still getting that. So we must have an issue with the tool. So with that being said, we'll just use that for now and pretend like it worked. So one of the issues, I don't know if you noticed on the symbol originally, is while it's great that it's auto-splitting, it's not necessarily using the correct USITT approved symbols. Right, so the USITT approved symbol for even a door, which is what would be applicable right here, would have this is dashed here and here. The opening part is perfectly fine, and we don't construct walls the same way, right? Our flats are not done in that same way. So I'm going to show you how we can easily do this, dealing with the actual symbols. There is a time and a place for the wall and door tool. Like you've seen here, it's kind of finicky. You saw I put in the correct things, and it didn't come out the way we wanted. So in this case, I'm going to use a thicker line, use a 7, and again that 2-minute warning has come up, and I'm going to draw my flat. Just zoom it in a little bit. Okay. So now, my suggestion is actually to use the rectangle tool here. You could also use the double dash line tool. Double dash line tool is right next to the rectangle tool. And we got that. And again, you want to make the solid a none. And then you want to say line type. And you want the dash to be a little bit more consistent, so you're going to change the pen tool, and you're going to say short dashed. And there's a short dashed line. That's selected. And that looks relatively consistent with the symbol. Okay, so that's done there. So I'm going to select off of it. Now we're going to deal with the door itself. The door itself is just a single line. So again, I'm going to go back to that 0.7. And it's a single line at an angle. That's done. Okay. And so now we need an arc. So I'm just going to select that arc tool. And I'm going to draw an arc that fits my needs. So I'm going to pick 3 points along line. Again, that's another 2-minute warning. I'm going to pick 3 points along line. That's 1 point, that's 2 point, and that's 3 point. Now, notice how my arc is not fitting what I need. So it was using the snapping, and it ended up giving me something I didn't want as an end result. So let's try that one more time. So I'm going to turn off all snapping. And notice how it gives me exactly what I wanted. Now, there's a fill here. You can notice that that kind of filled in. I'm going to just make sure I turn that to none. And then I'm going to put that arrowhead on. And again, I like that rounded arrowhead. Again, it's too large, so we remember from the last time that we want to say edit attributes. And so that's down here, and edit marker. So that shows the different markers that are available. And instead, we want to say custom. And then remember, if we change that to 0.25, excuse me, that becomes the correct size, right? We may want to extend our arc if we feel like the arrowhead makes it too small. There's your case doorway. Windows with buttons and mullions. That's actually very simple. What I would suggest is using the same technique that we used before. Adding a small box here. Again, you want to make the fill a none. And then you want to draw the lines for the buttons and mullions. You can continue that on. I'm going to go ahead and delete this because this is a similar item. Edit and undo. Double swing doors, simple as the first, right? You want to make sure you're lined up. And in this case, you actually do want snapping to be on so you can get those nice 45s. Again, casement windows operate the same as doorways, except for they split center. Flat door with sliding, it's actually very similar. You just end up inserting line types. So these symbols that looked a little bit ominous are actually quite easy. Okay, so I'm going to take those away. And notice we're left with our good symbols. Platforms. Platforms are actually, and I'm going to again use my spacebar, platforms are actually really easy to use. And I think you're going to actually enjoy drawing these. So again, these are not necessarily in scale, but we can easily draw them. Again, that's just a box, and I'm going to use a medium weight line, so I'm going to use a 0.25. Now, the X on these platforms is shown that it has a fill, right? So how do we get an X? Well, instead of solid fill color, we want a hatch. And in this case, we may have to make our own hatch, right? Because do you see one that's an X? Right, again, this is where we deviate from standard architectural usage, which is where windows are typically only marked out with X's rather than platforms and other things, because platforms don't necessarily exist in architecture. Now, there are other categories. There's some ANSI and other categories, but I can tell you now that you're not necessarily going to find what you want. So we're going to have to use another way other than hatch. So what might that way be? Well, there are patterns. I don't think that's going to give you what you want. Right? I mean, you can have a brick pattern. Again, none of these are really what you want. Unfortunately, the only one that really functions is none. And none is actually clear. It gives you the appearance that it worked because it shows the X from below. Right? So you've got a couple ways to do this. You could actually make your own fill style, your own pattern, but the easiest way is actually to draw a little X. Right? There are a couple of other ways to do this, and I can, of course, show you those in class. It's just a little bit more complicated, but for right now, just drawing the X is perfectly fine. Right? And then I'm going to select those and make them not 0.7. I'm going to make those the same as the others, which is 0.25. There we go. And that's done. Same thing applies to oblique-shaped platforms, right? That's more of a rhombus. And then same thing applies when you're putting platforms together. Stairs. Stairs are interesting, and ramps are interesting. So stairs and ramps are done very similar. Stairs can be done with either stair tools, which we can deal with later in class when we're dealing with 3D objects, or you can actually just make them with rectangles. Irregular height stairs that you see here are not something that we're going to commonly encounter at Shenandoah or in your drafting, but can certainly be accommodated. It simply means that each stair tread gets its own height indicator versus the standard tool where you literally show the lowest and the highest. And the stair tool actually automatically does this for you. If you have a standard staircase, it works really well. In theater, we don't normally have standard staircases or standard anything, quite frankly. So it's not necessarily as helpful. Ramps operate on the same principle. And again, if you have to do this manually, you just type in the starting height, the ending height, and you draw a line between them to indicate that it's going up at a consistent angle. That's what's called a typical. So drapes without fullness, moving forward, drapes without fullness is simply a line that's capped. Now, actually, this is kind of interesting. So you can actually create a custom arrowhead that would be a cap. Or you can just simply draw the little extra piece. So if you wanted to draw a custom, so you could actually say that you wanted, something different here and actually make that. Right? That's actually pretty easy to do, but it not necessarily worth your time. I hate to say it, but because you can quickly just go boop, and you've drawn your end cap. Right, that's literally showing the event. Sorry, I got Siri open. Same thing, border without fullness. Border without fullness is drawn this way with the dashed line to indicate that it doesn't hit the ground, right? That there's space below to play or act or anything else. Again, drapes with fullness. Drapes with fullness is actually another interesting aspect because I'm going to get there in a second. Sorry, my tool set window is very small. Gotta locate this. Oh, here we go. They've moved it around slightly in 19. It used to be that everything was under the lighting section. So if you go to the soft goods tool, which I've now activated, right, you can actually tell it what it is, a height, whether or not you want to show center line, whether you want pipe markers, right? So it'll actually draw that previous item for you. The only problem with this is it makes the file a little larger. So if you're trying to make something real small, it won't work as well because it's trying to draw it in 3D normally unless you click the simple 2D object, which is what I'm going to do right now because we're not necessarily at 3D yet. So I'm going to say curtain, height 20 feet, that's fine. And I'm going to say pleat width 2 inches, that's fine. Say alright. And notice how it's still drawing a simple two-dimensional line. So let's see how we can make that work correctly. So I'm going to take off simple 2D and see how it says fullness. Let's try fullness 100%. See how that's not changing, right? So we have a couple of different ways to approach this. So I'm going to actually delete it and start again because I want to show you something kind of interesting. I'm going to hit that shift key to make a straight line. And then I'm going to end that. And we get exactly what we wanted, although I had that little hiccup at the end. So I need to make sure I double click and see how we're getting a nice ending. Now, the fullness is actually represented exactly in the drawing. So if I said 500% fullness, it's going to make that a more full drape. Does that make sense? So as I change settings, and again, because it's a more difficult situation with the computer, it's going to take a moment for it to fly through. So if we actually look, it actually created these as real drawings and real objects. If we pop over to OpenGL, you can see it made black curtains for us. So I'm going to go back to wireframe, and I'm going to go back to our top plan view. Again, it doesn't have to look exactly like this. This is actually dealing with a stencil template from many, many years ago. I would rather you use the drape tool and have it do what you need. Now, with that being said, if you're making it a border, you can simply click on this and do what we've done before. You would just simply say line type, dashed, and look, you've got borders without fullness. Or sorry, borders with fullness that are not touching the ground. I hope that section makes sense. If that was confusing at all, please find me and I'm happy to help. Same thing with travelers. You actually just draw the straight line and then put these drapes at the very end. So that wraps up our general usage for this section and for this homework. I hope that helps you, and have a wonderful time, and I will see you very shortly.